Hey everyone, tonight we journey into the shadows of the Old Republic, where a single slave would rise to command the very spirits of ancient Sith Lords and wield power that could shake the foundations of the galaxy itself. This is the complete story of Darth Nox, the most feared sorcerer in Sith history, whose hunger for forbidden knowledge would transform them from nameless chattel into a Dark Lord whose very name whispered death across 1,000 worlds. But before we descend into those ancient tombs together, I need to ask for your help. Surprisingly, 79% of you watching this aren't subscribed yet, and hitting that subscribe button truly helps this channel grow and bring you more of these epic galactic legends. So if you enjoy diving deep into Star Wars lore and these long-form stories, please consider subscribing. Also, I'd love to hear from our global community. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Whether you're winding down after a long day or just starting your evening, it's incredible to connect with fellow Star Wars fans across the globe. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let's begin this dark odyssey together. In the deepest vaults beneath Drummond Cass, where even the Emperor's own guards fear to tread, ancient stone tablets speak of a prophecy. They tell of one who would come bearing chains, yet would bind the very essence of dead gods to their will. One who would walk among the tombs of Korriban not as a pilgrim, but as a collector of souls. The tablets cracked and bled when this prophecy came to pass, for even stone cannot bear witness to such power without trembling. But this story begins not in those shadowed halls of ultimate power, but in the dust and desperation of slavery, where a Force-sensitive child would first taste the intoxicating promise of the dark side. It begins with lightning dancing between trembling fingers, with whispered secrets from voices that had been silent for millennia, and with the first terrible realization that death itself could be made to serve. You see, most Sith Lords are content to rule through fear, to command through strength, to dominate through passion. But Nox sought something far more profound and infinitely more dangerous. They sought to become the bridge between the living and the dead, to gather the accumulated wisdom of every fallen Sith Lord who had ever drawn breath, and to bind their very essence into a collection of power that no single being should possess. Imagine walking through the ancient tombs on Korriban, feeling the weight of millennia pressing down upon you, hearing the whispers of long-dead Dark Lords echoing through chambers that have known only silence for centuries. Now imagine those whispers weren't just memories or echoes, but actual conversations, actual negotiations with spirits so powerful that their mere attention could drive lesser minds to madness. This was Nox's gift, and this was their curse. But on that fateful day when Imperial scouts discovered a Force-sensitive slave working in the Outer Rim territories, none could have predicted that they were looking upon the future master of death itself. The young slave who would become Nox possessed something that even the most learned Sith scholars couldn't fully understand at first. Where others saw the Force as energy to be channeled, Nox saw it as a vast network connecting every living thing to every dead thing, a cosmic web that could be manipulated, rewoven, and ultimately commanded. The lightning that would later char the flesh of enemies and crack the stones of ancient temples first manifested as barely controlled sparks in slave quarters. The voice that would one day command the respect of the Dark Council began as frightened whispers in the darkness, and the mind that would eventually house the consciousness of multiple ancient Sith Lords started as simply a desperate will to survive, to escape, to become something more than property. But perhaps most terrifying of all was what happened in those quiet moments between the chaos, when young Nox would close their eyes and suddenly find themselves in conversation with shadows that shouldn't exist, learning secrets from teachers who had been dust for 1,000 years, and slowly, inevitably, beginning to understand that death was not an ending, but merely another form of servitude waiting to be exploited. This is that story. This is how a slave became a legend, how a student became a master of masters, and how one being's hunger for knowledge reshaped the very nature of what it means to wield the dark side of the Force. The Outer Rim territories have always been a place where the galaxy's unwanted find themselves forgotten, where slave markets thrive in the shadows between legitimate commerce and outright piracy. It was here, on a world whose name has been lost to time and imperial records, that the future Darth Nox spent their early years as property, their Force sensitivity hidden beneath layers of survival instinct and carefully suppressed emotion. The Empire's talent scouts moved through these forgotten worlds like predators, always hunting for Force-sensitive children who could be molded into instruments of the dark side. When they found the young slave who would become Nox, the signs were unmistakable. Tools bent and twisted when the child was angry. Small animals fled their presence even when they tried to be gentle. And sometimes, in the depths of exhausted sleep, other slaves would swear they heard the child speaking to people who weren't there, carrying on conversations in languages that sounded older than civilization itself. The Imperial scout who discovered them was a weathered veteran named Captain Korriban, a man who had delivered dozens of Force-sensitive children to the Sith Academy on Korriban. He later wrote in his personal log that this particular slave was different from the others. Where most Force-sensitive children radiated raw emotion that any trained individual could sense, this one seemed to pull emotion inward, creating a strange void that was somehow more unsettling than the usual chaos of untrained power. The journey to Korriban took 3 weeks through hyperspace, and by all accounts, it was during this trip that the future Nox first began to truly understand their unique gift. Isolated in the ship's holding cells, away from the distractions of daily survival, they found themselves able to reach out with the Force in ways that felt both natural and deeply wrong. They could sense the lingering impressions of every person who had ever occupied that cell, could feel the echoes of their fear, their anger, their despair. But more than that, they could speak to those echoes, could draw knowledge from imprints that should have faded long ago. By the time the transport emerged from hyperspace above the red sands of Korriban, the young slave had already begun to change. Their eyes had developed a depth that spoke of knowledge beyond their years, and their voice carried undertones that made even the ship's guards uncomfortable. Captain Korriban noted in his final log entry about the delivery that he was relieved to be rid of his cargo, though he couldn't quite explain why. Korriban itself struck the new arrival like a physical blow. The planet's very atmosphere thrummed with dark side energy, accumulated over millennia of Sith presence. Ancient tombs dotted the landscape like massive stone sentinels, each one a repository of knowledge, power, and malevolent intent. The Valley of the Dark Lords stretched out beneath a perpetually blood-red sky, and even from orbit, sensitive individuals could feel the weight of untold centuries of darkness pressing down upon them. The Sith Academy rose from the desert like a monument to ancient cruelty, its black stone walls carved with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. Here, the Empire's most promising Force-sensitive recruits were either forged into instruments of the dark side or destroyed in the attempt. The mortality rate among new acolytes was deliberately kept high, ensuring that only the strongest, most cunning, and most ruthless would survive to become true Sith. Upon arrival at the Academy, the former slave was processed through the same brutal system that had created countless Sith Lords throughout Imperial history. They were stripped of any remnant of their former identity, given basic robes and a simple vibroblade, and thrust into a dormitory with other new arrivals. The message was clear from the first moment: your past life is over, your former self is dead, and only those strong enough to embrace the dark side completely will see another sunrise. It was here that they first encountered Overseer Harkoon, the Academy's most notorious instructor and a Sith pureblood who took particular pleasure in tormenting human acolytes. Harkoon represented everything the Academy stood for: casual cruelty, arbitrary authority, and the constant reminder that weakness in any form would result in immediate death. He looked upon the new arrivals with the cold assessment of a butcher evaluating cattle, already deciding which ones might prove useful and which ones would simply provide entertainment before their inevitable demise. But even in those first moments, as Harkoon's gaze swept over the group of terrified new acolytes, something about the former slave caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way they didn't flinch under scrutiny, or the manner in which they seemed to be listening to voices no one else could hear. Whatever it was, Harkoon made a mental note to pay special attention to this particular student. He had no way of knowing that he was looking upon the future master of ancient Sith spirits, the one who would eventually command powers that would make even his own considerable abilities seem like parlor tricks. The Academy's orientation was designed to break the spirit before rebuilding it in the Sith image. But as the former slave listened to Harkoon's welcoming speech about pain, suffering, and the glorious tradition of Sith dominance, they were also hearing other voices, whispers from the ancient tombs that surrounded the Academy, fragments of conversation from Sith Lords whose names had been spoken with fear across the galaxy for thousands of years. The transformation had begun. The Sith Academy operated on a principle as old as the dark side itself. Only through conflict could true strength emerge. Within days of arrival, the new acolyte who would become Nox found themselves thrust into the first of many trials that would either forge them into a weapon worthy of the Sith or claim their life in the attempt. The Academy's curriculum was deceptively simple on the surface, consisting primarily of expeditions into the ancient tombs that surrounded the facility, but the reality was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Overseer Harkoon divided the new arrivals into competing groups, each tasked with retrieving specific artifacts from tombs that had claimed the lives of countless previous students. The pure-blood Sith took particular pleasure in assigning the most dangerous missions to human acolytes, viewing their struggles as entertainment and their deaths as acceptable losses in the grand scheme of Sith education. However, what Harkoon hadn't anticipated was how the former slave would approach these seemingly impossible tasks. The tomb of Marka Ragnos became the site of the first true revelation of what made this particular acolyte different from all others. Marka Ragnos had been one of the most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history, ruling the ancient Sith Empire for over a century before his death. His tomb was considered one of the most dangerous locations on Korriban, filled with deadly traps, malevolent spirits, and challenges that tested both physical prowess and force sensitivity in equal measure. While other acolytes approached the tomb with the brute force tactics typically favored by Sith training, the future Nox did something unprecedented. They sat in meditation at the tomb's entrance for hours, not moving, barely breathing, simply listening to voices that others couldn't hear. Fellow acolytes mocked this apparent hesitation, viewing it as weakness or fear. Even Harkoon began to wonder if he had misjudged this student's potential. But what was actually happening during those long hours of apparent inactivity was something that would have terrified even experienced Sith Lords. The young acolyte was conducting detailed conversations with the lingering spirit of Marka Ragnos himself, learning not just the location of the required artifact, but the tomb's complete history, its hidden passages, and most importantly, the true nature of the trials within. By the time they finally entered the tomb, they weren't stumbling through unknown dangers like their peers, but walking through familiar territory guided by one of history's most formidable Sith Lords. The retrieval of the artifact from Marka Ragnos' tomb was accomplished with an efficiency that left both Harkoon and fellow students speechless. Where others had spent days fighting through traps and puzzles, often emerging wounded or not at all, this acolyte completed the trial in mere hours and returned unscathed. More disturbing still was the change that had come over them during the expedition. They carried themselves with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, spoke with knowledge that exceeded their formal education, and most unnervingly of all, their eyes had developed a depth that suggested they were no longer entirely alone in their own mind. The tomb of Tulak Horde presented the next major challenge. And it was here that the Acolyte's unusual abilities truly began to manifest in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Tulak Hord had been known as the Lord of Hate, a Sith so consumed by the dark side that his very presence could drive enemies to madness. His tomb was considered even more dangerous than that of Marka Ragnos, filled with illusions designed to exploit an intruder's deepest fears and weaknesses. But again, the future Nox approached this challenge in a manner that defied conventional Sith wisdom. Rather than fighting against the tomb's psychological attacks, they embraced them, allowing the dark energies to flow through them while maintaining perfect mental discipline. What the other acolytes experienced as terrifying hallucinations, this student perceived as educational opportunities, learning from the preserved emotions and memories that saturated every stone of the ancient structure. It was during this trial that the first clear manifestation of Force lightning occurred. Not the wild, uncontrolled bursts typical of emotional outburst, but precise, deliberate streams of electrical energy that responded to conscious direction. The lightning didn't just destroy the tomb's guardian constructs, it seemed to drain their energy, channeling their power back into the wielder in a display that left even the tomb's ancient systems confused and disoriented. Vossen Althi, a fellow acolyte who had quickly established himself as one of the most promising students in their group, began to take notice of these unusual developments. Vossen was everything the Academy valued in a potential Sith: ambitious, ruthless, physically imposing, and possessed of the kind of raw force talent that typically guaranteed survival through the trials. He had expected to dominate his fellow students through conventional displays of power and intimidation, but the former slave's unconventional methods were achieving results that his more traditional approach couldn't match. The rivalry that developed between Fon, the future Nox, represented more than simple competition between students. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of Sith power itself. Fon believed in the direct application of Force abilities, in overwhelming opposition through superior strength and unshakable will. The future Nox, by contrast, had begun to understand that true power came not from personal strength alone, but from the ability to draw upon resources that others couldn't access or even perceive. Their philosophical differences came to a head during a group trial in the tomb of Dreshti, an ancient Sith Lord whose name had been almost completely erased from historical records. The tomb's central challenge required the acolytes to work together to overcome a series of interconnected puzzles that couldn't be solved through individual effort alone. Farfan's approach was to attempt to dominate the group through force of personality and superior combat skills, essentially making himself the leader through intimidation. The future Nox took a completely different approach. Rather than competing for leadership, they quietly began communicating with the tomb's lingering spiritual presence, learning the true nature of the puzzles and the philosophical lessons they were meant to teach. While Fon shouted orders and threatened violence against anyone who questioned his authority, the future Nox was receiving detailed instruction from a Sith Lord who had been dead for millennia, but whose knowledge remained perfectly preserved within the tomb's Force impressions. The resolution of this trial marked a turning point in how both fellow students and Academy instructors perceived this unusual acolyte. Not only did they solve the tomb's central mystery, they did so in a way that demonstrated a level of understanding about ancient Sith philosophy that exceeded their formal education by centuries. They explained complex relationships between different aspects of dark side mastery using terminology and concepts that hadn't been taught in Academy classes for generations. Overseer Harkun's initial skepticism began to transform into something approaching grudging respect, though he was careful not to show favoritism toward any particular student. The Academy's educational philosophy demanded that promising acolytes be pushed to their absolute limits, tested until they either transcended their previous capabilities or were destroyed by challenges beyond their current abilities. But perhaps the most significant development during these trials was the growing collection of spiritual contacts that the future Nox was accumulating. Each tomb visit resulted not just in the completion of assigned tasks, but in the establishment of ongoing relationships with ancient Sith Lords whose consciousness had been preserved in various forms throughout the centuries. These weren't simple echoes or force impressions, but actual personalities with whom complex negotiations and agreements could be conducted. By the time the Academy trials reached their conclusion, it had become clear to everyone involved that this particular acolyte represented something unprecedented in Sith education. They had not only survived challenges that had claimed numerous previous students, but had done so while demonstrating abilities that seemed to blur the line between life and death, between individual power and collective ancient wisdom. The selection as Darth Zash's apprentice came as both a recognition of exceptional potential and the beginning of an entirely new phase of Sith education. Darth Zash was known throughout the Empire as one of the most learned Sith Lords of her generation, a master of ancient knowledge whose personal library contained texts and artifacts that predated the Republic itself. Her decision to claim the former slave as her apprentice sent ripples through the entire Academy hierarchy. But as the newly selected apprentice prepared to leave Korriban behind and begin the next phase of their transformation, the ancient spirits they had befriended whispered warnings about the path ahead. Darth Zash's interest in their abilities went far beyond simple mentorship, and the knowledge she possessed came with prices that few students were prepared to pay. The trials of the Academy had been merely a preparation for challenges that would test not just their power and knowledge, but the very essence of who they were becoming. Darth Zash cut an imposing figure, even by the standards of the Dark Council's most influential members. Her reputation as a scholar of ancient Sith knowledge preceded her wherever she traveled throughout Imperial space, and her personal archives were said to contain secrets that even the Emperor himself might covet. When she arrived at the Korriban Academy to claim her new apprentice, students and instructors alike recognized that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance. The newly selected apprentice's first impression of their master was of someone who had transcended the crude power struggles that typically defined Sith relationships. Where most Sith Lords relied on intimidation and displays of raw force ability to maintain their authority, Zash projected an aura of intellectual superiority that was somehow more unsettling than conventional threats. She spoke in measured tones that suggested vast depths of knowledge, and her questions probed not just for factual understanding, but for philosophical insight that few could provide. The journey from Korriban to Dromund Kaz aboard Zash's personal vessel provided the first real opportunity for master and apprentice to establish the parameters of their relationship. The ship itself was a marvel of both Imperial engineering and Sith customization, featuring meditation chambers lined with ancient stone taken from tombs across the galaxy, libraries containing texts in languages that predated modern galactic civilization, and laboratories equipped for experiments that pushed the boundaries between science and sorcery. During the hyperspace journey, Zash began to reveal the true scope of her interests and ambitions. Her fascination with ancient Sith knowledge wasn't merely academic curiosity, but part of a larger research project that had consumed decades of her life. She had become convinced that the modern Sith had lost touch with powers and techniques that their predecessors had considered fundamental to dark side mastery. Her goal was nothing less than the complete reconstruction of ancient Sith capabilities, regardless of the cost or consequences. But beneath her scholarly exterior, Zash harbored a secret that would eventually reshape both their destinies. Her body was failing, consumed by decades of exposure to dark side energies and ancient artifacts that carried their own malevolent influences. The physical deterioration was subtle but inexorable, and she had become desperate to find a solution that would allow her to continue her research indefinitely. The answer she had discovered in her most forbidden texts was both elegant and horrifying in its simplicity. The apprentice began to suspect that their selection had been based on more than just demonstrated potential during the Academy trials. Zash's questions during their conversations consistently returned to topics related to consciousness, identity, and the relationship between mind and body. She seemed particularly interested in their unique ability to communicate with ancient spirits, viewing it not as a curiosity but as evidence of capabilities that might prove essential to her long-term plans. Their first major assignment took them to Dromund itself, the dark heart of the Sith Empire, where the most ambitious and dangerous individuals in the galaxy gathered to pursue their schemes for power and dominance. The imperial capital was a city built on layers of ambition and betrayal, where ancient Sith temples shared space with modern government facilities, and every conversation carried undertones of potential treachery. It was here that the apprentice first encountered Kem Val, an ancient Dashade who had served Sith Lords for centuries before being placed in suspended animation to await a worthy new master. The Dashade was a creature of living shadow and hunger, a being whose very existence was sustained by consuming force energy from other living creatures. His revival and binding to the apprentice represented Zash's first major gift to her new student, though like all her gifts, it came with complications that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Kem Val's memories stretched back through centuries of Sith history, and his perspective on events provided context that no historical text could offer. He had served under Tulak Horde himself, had witnessed the rise and fall of multiple Sith empires, and had observed the gradual changes in Sith philosophy and methods over the centuries. His presence added another layer to the apprentice's growing collection of ancient advisors, though unlike the tomb spirits, Kem Val remained physically present and actively involved in their ongoing adventures. The integration into Dromund society required navigating political complexities that made the Academy's competitive atmosphere seem simple by comparison. Every Sith Lord maintained networks of allies, servants, and rivals whose relationships shifted constantly based on perceived advantage and opportunity. Zash's position within this hierarchy was secure but not unassailable, and her apprentice's actions would inevitably reflect upon her reputation and standing. Their first joint expedition took them to the ancient ruins that dotted Dromund jungle landscape, remnants of civilizations that had flourished and fallen long before the current Sith Empire claimed the planet as their capital. These sites contained artifacts and knowledge that Zash needed for her research, but they also served as testing grounds where the apprentice could develop their abilities under more controlled conditions than the chaotic tomb trials of Korriban. The dark side energies that saturated Dromund created an environment where force abilities were amplified and refined in ways that weren't possible on more neutral worlds. The apprentice found that their connection to ancient spirits became stronger and clearer, allowing for more detailed communications and more complex negotiations with consciousnesses that had been preserved for millennia. It was during these expeditions that Zash began to introduce her apprentice to the theoretical foundations of Sith alchemy, the ancient art of using force energy to transform matter and consciousness according to the practitioner's will. The techniques she taught went far beyond the crude torture methods typically associated with Sith interrogation, encompassing sophisticated procedures for preserving knowledge, enhancing physical capabilities, and most significantly, manipulating the relationship between consciousness and physical form. The apprentice's progress in these studies exceeded even Zash's optimistic expectations. Where other students had required years to master basic alchemical principles, her new apprentice demonstrated an intuitive understanding of complex theoretical relationships that suggested either exceptional natural talent or access to knowledge sources beyond conventional education. The truth, of course, was that their ancient spirit advisors were providing guidance and instruction that complemented Zash's formal teachings. But as the months passed, and the apprentice's abilities continued to develop at an unprecedented rate, Zash's demeanor began to change in subtle ways. Her questions became more probing and personal, focusing increasingly on the apprentice's understanding of identity and consciousness. She began assigning research projects that required investigation into the darkest and most forbidden aspects of Sith knowledge, areas where even experienced lords feared to tread without extensive preparation. The first major expedition beyond Kais took them to Balmorra, an industrial world where ancient Sith artifacts had been discovered buried beneath modern factories. The assignment appeared straightforward: retrieve the artifacts and return them to Zash's laboratories for analysis. But the reality proved far more complex, requiring navigation of both imperial military politics and corporate interests that viewed any disruption to their operations as unacceptable interference. The Balmorra expedition also provided the apprentices' first real experience with the broader galactic conflict that was reshaping civilized space. The Cold War between Empire and Republic was heating up, and worlds like Balmorra were becoming flashpoints where political disagreements could escalate into open warfare with devastating consequences for local populations. The apprentice began to understand that their personal development as a Sith was taking place against a backdrop of galactic upheaval that would eventually demand their direct participation. Nar Shaddaa offered a completely different set of challenges when Zash's research led them to the smuggler's moon in search of artifacts that had found their way into private collections. The underworld of Nar Shaddaa operated according to rules that had nothing to do with Force sensitivity or Sith hierarchy, where credits and reputation mattered more than ancient bloodlines or mystical abilities. Successfully navigating this environment required diplomatic skills and practical cunning that the Academy had never attempted to teach. Throughout these adventures, Zash continued her subtle probing into the nature of her apprentices' unique abilities and the extent of their potential for future development. Her questions became increasingly focused on technical aspects of consciousness transfer and identity preservation, topics that seemed tangentially related to their current research, but clearly held deeper significance for her long-term plans. The apprentice's growing collection of ancient spirit advisors provided perspective on Zash's behavior that would have been impossible to gain through direct observation alone. The bound Sith Lords who had experienced similar relationships in their own lifetimes recognized patterns of manipulation and preparation that suggested their current master was planning something far more complex and dangerous than straightforward mentorship. Their warnings became increasingly urgent as Zash's true intentions began to crystallize through her actions and research priorities. By the time the apprentice had established themselves as a formidable presence within Imperial society, the stage was set for revelations that would transform everything they thought they understood about their relationship with their master and their role in her grand design. The galaxy held secrets older than recorded history, and Darth Zash's research had identified dozens of worlds where traces of ancient Sith civilization lay buried beneath layers of time and forgetting. Each expedition became both an archaeological adventure and a test of the apprentice's growing mastery over forces that most Sith never learned to comprehend, let alone control. These journeys would take them from the scorching deserts of Tatooine to the political intrigues of Alderaan, each world offering its own unique challenges and revelations. Tatooine seemed an unlikely place to search for Sith artifacts, its endless dunes and primitive settlements giving no hint of the profound secrets buried in its depths. But Zash's research had uncovered references to an ancient Sith expedition that had crashed on the desert world millennia ago, carrying with it knowledge and artifacts that had been lost to time. The survivors had established a hidden facility before succumbing to the harsh environment, leaving behind only cryptic markers that could guide worthy successors to their final resting place. The desert world's twin suns beat down mercilessly as master and apprentice began their search, following clues that led them far from any established settlements into regions where even the hardy moisture farmers feared to venture. The Force signatures they sought were deeply buried, masked by centuries of sand and wind, requiring techniques that pushed the boundaries of conventional archaeological methods. It was here, in the deep desert silence broken only by shifting sand and distant winds, that the apprentice first began to understand the true scale of what they were attempting. The spirits of the ancient Sith Lords who had died on Tatooine still lingered in the area, their consciousness preserved not in stone or crystal, as was typical, but in the very sand itself, dispersed across vast areas that would have taken conventional search methods decades to explore. The communication techniques required to reach these dispersed consciousnesses demanded a level of force sensitivity that few Sith had ever achieved. Rather than the focused conversations possible with tomb-bound spirits, this required a kind of mystical archaeology, piecing together fragments of memory and knowledge scattered across the landscape like pieces of a vast puzzle. The apprentice found themselves spending days in deep meditation, slowly gathering these fragments and assembling them into coherent information about the lost expedition and its ultimate fate. The discovery, when it finally came, exceeded even Zash's most optimistic expectations. The ancient facility had been built not as a temporary shelter, but as a preservation vault designed to protect the expedition's most valuable cargo until worthy successors could claim it. The knowledge contained within these archives predated most of the texts in Zash's own collection, offering insights into Sith techniques and philosophies that had been completely forgotten by modern practitioners. But perhaps more significant than the written records were the preserved consciousnesses of the expedition members themselves, ancient Sith Lords who had chosen to bind their spirits to the facility's protective systems rather than allow their knowledge to die with their bodies. The apprentice found themselves in conversation with individuals who had learned their craft directly from the legendary founders of Sith civilization, whose understanding of the dark side came from sources that modern scholarship could only theorize about. Alderaan presented challenges of an entirely different nature, requiring the apprentice to navigate not just physical dangers, but the complex political relationships between the planet's noble houses. The ancient Sith presence on Alderaan dated back to periods when the boundaries between Republic and Imperial space were fluid, when individual Sith Lords had established their own domains on worlds that would later become symbols of Republic idealism. The noble house politics of Alderaan operated according to rules that had evolved over centuries of careful diplomacy and barely restrained ambition. Each house maintained its own agenda while publicly supporting the planet's peaceful reputation, and the presence of imperial archaeological expeditions created opportunities for alliances and betrayals that could reshape the entire planetary power structure. House Thul had discovered ancient ruins on their territory, but lacked the expertise to properly explore them, creating an opportunity for collaboration that served both their interests and Zash's research goals. The arrangement required delicate negotiations that balanced imperial authority with Alderaanian independence, while ensuring that any discoveries would ultimately serve the Empire's broader strategic objectives. The ruins themselves proved to be far more extensive than initial surveys had suggested, representing not just a single installation, but an entire complex that had served as a regional center for Sith operations during one of the ancient wars. The facility's preservation was remarkable, protected by systems that had continued functioning long after their creators had passed into legend. Working within these ruins, the apprentice encountered evidence of Sith techniques that differed significantly from both modern imperial methods and the ancient practices they had learned from tomb spirits. These Sith Lords had focused on integration with local populations rather than domination, building power structures that relied on willing cooperation rather than fear-based compliance. Their approach to the dark side emphasized sustainability and long-term growth rather than the immediate gratification that characterized most contemporary Sith philosophy. The knowledge preserved within the Alderaanian ruins included detailed instructions for techniques that the apprentice had been developing instinctively, providing formal structure and theoretical foundation for abilities that had previously relied on intuition and experimentation. The ancient text described methods for communicating with and binding force spirits that went far beyond anything taught in modern Sith academies, including procedures for establishing permanent relationships that could span centuries or even millennia. But the most significant discovery came in the form of warnings embedded throughout the ancient records. The Alderaanian Sith Lords had encountered others who shared the apprentice's unique gifts, individuals who could bridge the gap between life and death through force manipulation. Their experiences with such individuals had been mixed, some becoming powerful allies, while others had ultimately posed existential threats to their entire civilization. These warnings spoke of individuals who had accumulated so many spiritual advisors that their own identity became subsumed within the collective consciousness they had assembled. The ancient text described the progression from gifted student to possessed vessel, outlining signs and symptoms that could help identify when the balance between individual will and accumulated wisdom was shifting in dangerous directions. The apprentice found these warnings particularly disturbing because they recognized several of the early indicators in their own recent experiences. The voices of their spiritual advisors had become more insistent and detailed in recent months, offering not just guidance but specific directions that sometimes conflicted with their own instincts and preferences. The boundaries between their own thoughts and the accumulated wisdom of ancient Sith Lords were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish. During this period, Zash's attention to her apprentice's development became even more focused and intense. She began conducting regular evaluations that probed not just their mastery of force techniques, but their psychological state and sense of personal identity. Her questions consistently returned to themes related to consciousness, individuality, and the relationship between mind and spirit. The recruitment of Zalek during this phase provided both companionship and additional perspective on the changes occurring within the apprentice's development. Zalek was a Kaleesh warrior whose cultural background emphasized honor, loyalty, and spiritual connection to ancestral wisdom. His presence offered a counterbalance to the ancient Sith influences that were becoming increasingly dominant in the apprentice's daily experience. Training Zalek in Sith methods required the apprentice to articulate and explain concepts that had become second nature through their unique educational process. This teaching responsibility forced them to examine their own understanding more critically, identifying areas where ancient spiritual guidance had replaced personal comprehension without their conscious awareness. Zalek's questions often exposed assumptions and beliefs that the apprentice had absorbed from their spirit advisors without proper evaluation. His outsider perspective helped maintain some degree of independence from influences that were becoming increasingly pervasive and subtle in their manipulation of thought and behavior. As their collection of ancient knowledge and spiritual contacts continued to grow, the apprentice began to understand that they were approaching a threshold beyond which fundamental changes to their nature might become irreversible. The power and wisdom they were accumulating came with costs that weren't immediately apparent but would eventually demand payment in ways that could transform them into something entirely different from what they had originally intended to become. Zash's increasingly urgent research schedule and her growing desperation to complete certain experiments before her physical condition deteriorated further suggested that whatever revelation she was building toward would come sooner rather than later. The apprentice's unique abilities had clearly become central to plans that extended far beyond simple mentorship, and the ancient spirits they had befriended were beginning to express serious concerns about the direction their education was taking. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet observation, the kind of subtle realization that creeps into awareness like poison seeping through skin. Zash's increasing urgency about completing specific research projects, her questions that consistently probed the nature of consciousness and identity, her growing physical frailty that she tried desperately to conceal beneath layers of Sith dignity and ancient cosmetics. All these elements began to coalesce into a pattern that the apprentice's accumulated wisdom finally recognized for what it truly was. The ancient spirits who had become the apprentice's advisors and teachers had witnessed such schemes before across the millennia of Sith history. They whispered warnings about masters who viewed their students not as inheritors of knowledge, but as vessels to be claimed when their own bodies failed them. The technique itself was legendary among the most forbidden Sith arts, a process that required not just tremendous force sensitivity, but specific compatibility between master and apprentice that could take decades to cultivate properly. Zash had been preparing this moment since the day she first encountered reports of the unusual acolyte's performance during the Korriban trials. Every lesson, every expedition, every carefully guided discovery had been designed not just to develop the apprentice's abilities, but to create the precise psychological and spiritual conditions necessary for successful consciousness transfer. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. The very spiritual advisors that made the apprentice so valuable as a potential vessel were also the source of knowledge that might allow them to recognize and counter the impending betrayal. The final preparation took place in chambers beneath Zash's personal estate on Documentaries. Ritual spaces that had been constructed according to specifications found in texts so ancient that their original language had been dead for millennia before the Republic's founding. The stonework itself pulsed with dark side energy accumulated through decades of experiments and preparations, creating an atmosphere that felt alive with malevolent anticipation. Kem Vao's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic and conflicted. The ancient Dashad possessed memories of similar rituals from his centuries of service, and his loyalty programming warred with his growing recognition of what was about to unfold. His massive form would pace the corridors of Zash's estate like a caged predator, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by an agitation that spoke to conflicts deeper than mere concern for his current master's well-being. The apprentice found themselves caught between competing sources of advice and guidance. Their spirit advisors urged immediate flight, warning that Zash's preparations had reached a point where successful resistance would become increasingly difficult. Yet their formal training as a Sith demanded loyalty to their master, until such loyalty was definitively proven to be misplaced. The philosophical tension between these positions created an internal struggle that Zash herself seemed to encourage, viewing it as evidence that the consciousness transfer ritual would find fertile ground in a mind already accustomed to containing multiple competing viewpoints. When Zash finally revealed her intentions, she did so with the casual matter-of-factness that characterized all her scholarly pursuits. The consciousness transfer ritual represented simply another area of research that required practical experimentation to validate theoretical knowledge. That such experimentation would result in the complete destruction of her apprentice's individual identity was presented as an acceptable cost for advancing the boundaries of Sith understanding. Her justification drew upon philosophical arguments that had been used to rationalize such practices for thousands of years. Individual consciousness was merely a temporary arrangement of energy and information that would inevitably disperse upon physical death anyway. The ritual simply redirected that dispersion in ways that could preserve valuable knowledge and experience while providing it with a more suitable physical vessel for continued operation. The apprentice's unique abilities made them an ideal candidate for such transfer because their mind had already demonstrated the capacity to house multiple consciousness streams without complete psychological breakdown. The spirit advisors that they had accumulated were essentially providing practical training for the ultimate expansion that would occur when Zash's own consciousness joined their mental collective. The ritual chamber itself was a masterpiece of ancient Sith architecture and modern technological enhancement. Carved stone surfaces inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly surrounded sophisticated machinery designed to monitor and manipulate the force energies that would facilitate the consciousness transfer. The air itself felt thick with accumulated power, as if the very molecules had been saturated with dark side energy over years of preparation. As the ritual began, the apprentice discovered that their resistance was not entirely futile, despite Zash's overwhelming advantages in preparation and knowledge. The spirit advisors who had seemed like mere educational resources revealed themselves as active allies with their own investments in preventing Zash's success. Ancient Sith Lords who had spent millennia as bound spirits had no desire to see their carefully cultivated relationship with a promising young Sith Lord destroyed by an ambitious contemporary's selfish schemes. The battle that ensued transcended physical combat, taking place primarily within dimensions of consciousness and identity that few living beings had ever experienced directly. Zash's assault came not through force lightning or telekinetic manipulation, but through direct attacks on the apprentice's sense of self, attempting to erode the psychological boundaries that defined individual identity while simultaneously expanding her own consciousness to fill the spaces created by such erosion. But the apprentice's years of communication with ancient spirits had created mental structures that proved remarkably resilient against such intrusion. Rather than fighting Zash's consciousness transfer as a unified individual defending against external assault, they found themselves able to compartmentalize the attack while drawing upon the collective knowledge and experience of their spirit advisors to mount effective counter-strategies. The ritual reached its climax when the technological components of Zash's apparatus began to overload under the strain of energies they had never been designed to contain. The consciousness transfer process that should have been a straightforward replacement of one identity with another instead became a chaotic three-way struggle between Zash's desperate ambition, the apprentice's stubborn resistance, and the collective will of ancient Sith Lords who refused to see their carefully laid plans disrupted by contemporary interference. Kung Val's intervention at this critical moment tipped the balance in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. The ancient Dashid's loyalty programming finally resolved its internal conflicts by interpreting his duty in the most literal possible terms. His obligation was to serve the most powerful Sith Lord present, and as the ritual progressed it became increasingly clear that traditional measures of power were inadequate to determine which consciousness truly deserved his allegiance. The resolution, when it finally came, satisfied none of the original participants completely, while creating a situation that none had planned for or desired. Zash's consciousness was successfully transferred, but rather than replacing the apprentice's identity, it found itself trapped within a mind that already contained multiple other inhabitants. The apprentice retained primary control over their body and actions, but now shared their mental space with not just ancient spirit advisors, but with the active, ongoing presence of their former master. The psychological implications of this arrangement were immediately apparent to all parties involved. Zash found herself in the position of having achieved a form of immortality while being denied the autonomy that would make such immortality desirable. The apprentice had successfully resisted complete domination while accepting a permanent internal companion whose knowledge and ambitions would inevitably influence their future development. Kung Val's confusion about which consciousness truly represented his proper master created ongoing complications that would require careful management. His loyalty programming had been designed for simpler relationships where master and servant identities remained clearly distinct. The current situation challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which his behavioral conditioning had been constructed. The ancient spirit advisors who had participated in the struggle found themselves sharing mental space not just with their chosen student, but with a contemporary who possessed knowledge and perspectives that complemented their own historical experience. The potential for both conflict and collaboration within this expanded consciousness collective was enormous and largely unpredictable. As the immediate crisis resolved, and the participants began to adapt to their new circumstances, it became clear that the failed consciousness transfer ritual had created something unprecedented in Sith history. The apprentice had not just survived their master's betrayal, but had transformed it into an opportunity for accumulating even more ancient knowledge and power, while maintaining their individual agency and identity. But the price of such survival was the acceptance of permanent internal companionship that would influence every decision and action for the remainder of their existence. Zash's consciousness, now bound within their mind as thoroughly as any ancient spirit advisor, would serve as both resource and constraint, providing access to decades of specialized knowledge while demanding consideration in all future planning and development. The ritual's conclusion marked not just the end of a traditional master-apprentice relationship, but the beginning of something entirely new in the long history of Sith power and ambition. Freedom from Zash's direct control opened possibilities that the newly independent Sith had barely imagined during their years of apprenticeship. Yet this freedom came with its own complex challenges. Chief among them, the need to establish a unique identity and power base within the imperial hierarchy, while managing the unprecedented situation of housing multiple consciousness streams within a single mind. The solution that emerged from this necessity would reshape the apprentice's destiny and ultimately create a legend that would echo through galactic history for generations. The Imperial intelligence reports that crossed the Dark Council's attention during this period spoke of unusual force phenomena occurring across multiple star systems. Ancient Sith burial sites that had remained undisturbed for millennia were suddenly experiencing significant spiritual activity, as if long-dormant consciousnesses were awakening to some distant call. Archaeological expeditions reported encounters with Force ghosts who seemed to be actively seeking communication rather than defending their territories from intrusion. These reports represented more than mere curiosities to someone with the newly independent Sith's unique abilities. Each documented encounter suggested the presence of ancient knowledge and power that could be claimed by someone with the proper techniques and sufficient courage to attempt such dangerous binding rituals. What had begun as educational communication with tomb spirits during the Korriban trials could now evolve into a systematic campaign to collect the galaxy's most powerful Force ghosts. The decision to embark on this path was influenced by multiple factors beyond simple ambition for power. Zash's presence within the apprentice consciousness provided constant access to theoretical knowledge about spirit-binding techniques, while the ancient advisors who had been accumulated over previous years offered practical experience and warnings about potential dangers. More significantly, the chaotic political situation within the Empire created opportunities for independent Sith Lords to carve out their own domains without excessive oversight from traditional authority structures. Voss became the first major target for this expanded ghost hunting campaign, offering opportunities that were both exceptionally promising and extraordinarily dangerous. The planet's unique position as a neutral world with its own mystical traditions provided access to force phenomena that existed nowhere else in known space. The Voss species had developed their own relationship with what they called visions and prophecy, creating a spiritual ecosystem that had preserved consciousnesses and energies in forms that conventional Sith archaeology had never encountered. The approach to Voss required diplomatic finesse that the apprentice's previous education had barely touched upon. The planet's neutrality was jealously guarded by its inhabitants, who viewed both Imperial and Republic interference as threats to their ancient traditions. Successfully gaining access to the spiritual sites that housed the most powerful Force entities required negotiation with alien mystics, whose worldview bore little resemblance to either Jedi or Sith philosophy. The Voss understanding of Force sensitivity differed fundamentally from galactic standard interpretations, where Jedi spoke of light and dark sides as moral categories, and Sith viewed them as sources of power to be exploited. The Voss perceived the Force as a river of possibility that could be navigated but never truly controlled. Their seers and mystics had learned to interpret the currents of this cosmic river, reading meaning in spiritual phenomena that other traditions dismissed as mere echoes or imprints. Working within this framework required the apprentice to adapt their communication techniques in ways that respected Voss traditions while still achieving their own objectives. The spirit-binding rituals that had proven effective with conventional Sith Force ghosts needed modification to work with consciousnesses that had been preserved according to entirely different philosophical principles. The first successful binding of a Voss Ancient marked a turning point in the apprentices' understanding of their own capabilities. The consciousness they encountered possessed knowledge that predated galactic civilization, offering perspectives on Force manipulation that neither Jedi nor Sith traditions had ever explored. The binding process itself revealed new dimensions to the apprentices' abilities, suggesting that their talent extended far beyond simple communication with dead Sith Lords. But the most significant discovery came through the realization that different spiritual preservation methods created different opportunities for interaction and learning. Sith Force ghosts retained the personalities and ambitions they had possessed in life, making them powerful but often unreliable advisors whose own agendas could conflict with their host's objectives. Voss spiritual entities, by contrast, had undergone transformation processes that emphasized wisdom and guidance over individual personality traits. The integration of these diverse consciousness streams created internal dynamics that were both incredibly rich and potentially unstable. The apprentice found themselves mediating between competing viewpoints, not just from different historical periods, but from fundamentally different philosophical traditions. Managing such complexity required mental discipline techniques that pushed the boundaries of what any single mind should reasonably be expected to contain. Corellia provided the next major opportunity for expansion, though the circumstances were far more complicated than the relatively peaceful negotiations that had characterized the Voss expedition. The planet had become a battleground in the escalating conflict between Empire and Republic, with both sides competing for control of strategic facilities, while local population centers suffered the consequences of renewed galactic warfare. The ancient Sith presence on Corellia dated back to periods when the planet had served as a crossroads for multiple civilizations, creating a unique archaeological environment where different Force traditions had overlapped and influenced each other. The spirits preserved in these sites reflected this cultural mixing, offering knowledge that combined Sith techniques with approaches borrowed from traditions that had vanished from galactic memory. But retrieving these spiritual treasures required operating within an active war zone where Imperial forces, Republic troops, and Corellian resistance fighters were engaged in three-way conflicts that could shift without warning. The apprentice found themselves conducting delicate binding rituals while artillery bombardments shook ancient structures and military patrols posed constant threats to archaeological operations. The combat experience gained during the Corellia campaign proved invaluable for demonstrating the practical applications of the apprentice's accumulated spiritual advisors. Rather than relying on conventional Force techniques learned through formal training, they could draw upon the combined tactical knowledge of ancient generals and war leaders whose experience spanned multiple conflicts across galactic history. The fighting style that emerged from these circumstances was unlike anything documented in Imperial military manuals or Sith combat academies. Individual techniques flowed seamlessly between different historical approaches to Force combat, creating combinations that were both highly effective and completely unpredictable to opponents trained in contemporary methods. More importantly, the spiritual advisors provided strategic insight that extended beyond individual battles to encompass the broader political and military implications of the Corellia conflict. Ancient Sith Lords, who had participated in similar territorial disputes, offered perspective on long-term consequences that contemporary military planners were too focused on immediate objectives to consider properly. The reputation that began to develop around the apprentice during this period reflected both their growing power and the unusual nature of their abilities. Imperial intelligence reports described encounters with a Sith Lord who seemed to possess knowledge from multiple historical periods simultaneously, who could adapt their fighting style mid-combat to counter tactics they had never previously encountered, and who consistently demonstrated strategic thinking that exceeded what their formal education should have provided. These reports attracted attention from multiple levels of the imperial hierarchy, including members of the Dark Council who recognized that someone with such unusual capabilities could prove either a valuable asset or a significant threat to existing power structures. The apprentices' independence from traditional master-student relationships made them particularly interesting to council members who were always seeking new allies and potential protégés. But perhaps more significantly, the growing collection of bound spirits was beginning to attract attention from the spiritual realm itself. Other Force ghosts, sensing the presence of so many of their peers concentrated in a single location, began actively seeking out the apprentice rather than waiting to be discovered and bound. This phenomenon created opportunities for rapid expansion that were limited only by the apprentice's capacity to manage increasing numbers of consciousness streams within their already crowded mental space. The philosophical implications of housing dozens of ancient personalities were becoming increasingly complex as the collection grew. Each new spirit brought not just knowledge and power, but also opinions, preferences, and agendas that had to be balanced against existing inhabitants and the apprentice's own objectives. The internal negotiations required to maintain harmony within this expanded consciousness collective were becoming as complex as any external political maneuvering. Yet the benefits of such spiritual accumulation were undeniable. The apprentice command of Force techniques had expanded far beyond what any single tradition could provide, encompassing methods from civilizations that had flourished and fallen long before modern galactic society emerged. Their understanding of political strategy drew upon the experiences of rulers and generals who had shaped the course of galactic history across multiple eras. The meditation techniques required to maintain mental stability, while housing so many consciousness streams, were creating unexpected side effects. The apprentice found themselves developing forms of awareness that transcended normal sensory input, becoming sensitive to spiritual phenomena across vast distances and gaining insight into force currents that influenced galactic events on scales that individual actions rarely affected directly. As word of these unusual abilities spread throughout Imperial space, the apprentice began receiving invitations and requests from sources that ranged from Dark Council members seeking consultation to independent researchers who hoped to study the spirit-binding techniques that had proven so remarkably successful. The transformation from struggling academy graduate to recognized expert in ancient force phenomena had occurred with a rapidity that surprised even their accumulated spiritual advisors. The Dark Council of the Sith Empire represented the pinnacle of political and mystical authority within Imperial space, a gathering of the 12 most powerful Sith Lords whose decisions shaped the destiny of billions across countless star systems. Membership in this exclusive body was traditionally achieved through centuries of careful political maneuvering, decisive military victories, or demonstrations of force mastery so profound that they could not be ignored by existing council members. That someone barely past their apprenticeship years could be considered for such elevation spoke to circumstances that were unprecedented in Imperial history. The political landscape within the Empire had been dramatically altered by the escalating galactic conflict and the internal strife that characterized Sith society, even during periods of external crisis. Several Dark Council seats had become vacant through the usual combination of assassination, military disaster, and the occasional challenge duel that ended poorly for the incumbent. These vacancies created opportunities for advancement that ambitious Sith Lords throughout Imperial space were eager to claim through whatever methods might prove successful. The candidate who would become Darth Nox possessed advantages that were both obvious and subtle in their potential impact on council dynamics. Their accumulation of ancient spiritual advisors provided access to knowledge that even the most learned existing council members could not match, while their unique approach to force mastery suggested capabilities that could prove valuable in the increasingly complex challenges facing the Empire. But perhaps more importantly, Their relative independence from existing factional loyalties within the Council made them attractive to multiple power brokers who saw opportunity in supporting someone without established enemies or predetermined allegiances. The traditional Sith approach to advancement relied heavily on apprentice-master relationships that created long-term obligations and dependencies. The unusual circumstances of Zash's failed consciousness transfer ritual had freed the candidate from such conventional constraints. The formal nomination process required sponsorship from at least 3 existing Dark Council members, a requirement designed to ensure that new appointments would have sufficient support to function effectively within the Council's complex political environment. Securing such sponsorship required delicate negotiations that balanced the candidate's need for advancement against the sponsor's own agendas and long-term strategic objectives. Darth Zash, the Council's leading expert on ancient Sith knowledge and ritual, initially viewed the candidate's spiritual accumulation techniques with deep suspicion. The binding of Force ghosts was traditionally considered a dangerous practice that could lead to possession or madness, and the scale of the candidate's collection suggested either exceptional control or impending psychological collapse. Zash's eventual support came only after extensive demonstrations that the bound spirits were truly under the candidate's control rather than influencing them in ways that could threaten Council stability. The negotiations with other potential sponsors revealed the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized Dark Council politics during this turbulent period. Each member maintained their own intelligence networks, military assets, and philosophical commitments that influenced their assessment of new candidates. The process of building sufficient support required understanding and accommodating multiple different priorities while maintaining the independence that made the candidacy attractive in the first place. The trial by combat that sealed the candidate's elevation to the Dark Council was conducted according to ancient Sith traditions that emphasized not just individual prowess, but the ability to command resources and allies in pursuit of victory. The combat itself took place within the sacred dueling chambers beneath the Imperial Citadel on Dromund Kassa, spaces that had witnessed countless such contests throughout Imperial history. The opponent selected for this trial was Darth Zash, a traditional Sith Lord whose power base relied on conventional approaches to force mastery and political manipulation. Zash's combat style emphasized overwhelming offensive capability supported by decades of experience in lightsaber dueling and force technique application. His reputation as a dangerous opponent was well established throughout Imperial space, and his acceptance of the trial challenge was viewed as evidence of confidence that the outcome was essentially predetermined. But the combat that unfolded challenged every assumption about how such encounters should proceed. Rather than engaging in the direct lightsaber dueling that Zash had prepared for, the candidate employed tactics that drew upon the accumulated knowledge of dozens of ancient Force ghosts, creating combinations of technique and strategy that had never been documented in contemporary Sith training manuals. The bound spirits that served as the candidate's advisors provided real-time tactical analysis and historical precedent for countering every attack pattern that Zash employed. Ancient Sith Lords who had mastered combat techniques that predated modern lightsaber forms offered guidance that allowed the candidate to anticipate and respond to offensive combinations with precision that seemed almost prescient. More significantly, the spiritual advisors enabled the candidate to employ force techniques that combined different historical approaches in ways that created effects far beyond what any single tradition could achieve. Lightning attacks that incorporated principles from multiple ancient schools created energy patterns that conventional defenses were not designed to handle. Telekinetic manipulations that drew upon knowledge preserved by long-dead masters generated forces that seemed to violate the established limitations of individual force sensitivity. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who could draw upon the accumulated wisdom of galactic history proved as disruptive as the unusual techniques themselves. Scotia found himself fighting not just against a single adversary, but against an entire collection of ancient masters, whose combined experience encompassed every combat situation that Sith history had ever recorded. The climax of the duel came when the candidate demonstrated their ability to temporarily manifest the force signatures of their bound spirits, creating an effect that made it appear as if dozens of ancient Sith Lords were simultaneously participating in the combat. The overwhelming spiritual presence that filled the dueling chamber during this manifestation was so intense that even the observing Dark Council members were forced to reinforce their own mental defenses against the accumulated dark side energy. Scotia's defeat was total and decisive, but more importantly, it was achieved through methods that demonstrated capabilities beyond anything the Dark Council had previously encountered. The candidate had not simply won a duel, but had revealed forms of power that suggested potential applications far beyond individual combat encounters. The formal elevation ceremony that followed took place within the council chambers themselves, spaces that had been designed to accommodate the assembled presence of the Empire's most powerful force users, while managing the tremendous energies that such gatherings invariably generated. The ancient stonework and modern technological systems worked together to create an environment where even the most ambitious Sith Lords could interact without the constant risk of spontaneous violence. The title of Darth Nox was selected to reflect both the candidates' unique abilities and their destined role within the Council's power structure. The name itself derived from ancient Sith languages, where it suggested mastery over death and the ability to communicate with forces beyond the normal boundaries of life and mortality. It was a designation that had not been used for millennia, revived specifically to acknowledge capabilities that had no contemporary equivalent. The new Dark Council members' first official acts involved establishing a power base that could support their elevated status while accommodating the unique requirements of managing such an extensive collection of spiritual advisors. This necessitated the creation of facilities that were part laboratory, part library, and part shrine, spaces where ancient knowledge could be preserved and studied while maintaining the spiritual environments necessary for effective communication with bound force ghosts. The reaction throughout Imperial space to news of such an unusual elevation was mixed, with some viewing it as evidence of the Empire's continued vitality and adaptability, while others saw it as a dangerous departure from traditions that had served Sith civilization effectively for thousands of years. Military commanders who had worked with the new Darth Nox during various campaigns generally supported the advancement, having witnessed firsthand the practical benefits of access to accumulated ancient wisdom. But perhaps the most significant impact of the elevation was on the Dark Council's internal dynamics. The addition of someone with such unprecedented capabilities forced existing members to reconsider their own approaches to power and knowledge acquisition. The traditional competition between council members now included elements that had never been factors in previous rivalries, creating opportunities for both collaboration and conflict that would reshape Imperial politics for generations to come. The youngest Dark Council member in centuries brought to their new position not just personal ambition, but the accumulated dreams and objectives of dozens of ancient Sith Lords whose wisdom would now influence Imperial policy at the highest levels. The implications of such influence extended far beyond immediate political considerations to encompass questions about the very nature of Sith identity and the relationship between individual achievement and collective knowledge that would define the Empire's future development. The chambers that Darth Nox established within the depths of Dromund Chaos became something unprecedented in the history of the Sith Empire, spaces that existed at the intersection of archaeological research, mystical experimentation, and spiritual communion on a scale that defied conventional understanding. These were not merely libraries or laboratories in any traditional sense, but environments specifically designed to accommodate the complex requirements of housing and communicating with dozens of ancient Force spirits while conducting research that could unlock secrets hidden since the dawn of galactic civilization. The construction itself required techniques that blended modern Imperial engineering with methods preserved only in the memories of Nox's spiritual advisors. Ancient Sith Lords, who had overseen similar projects during their own lifetimes, provided detailed guidance about materials, architectural principles, and mystical considerations that contemporary builders had never encountered. The resulting structures seemed to exist partially outside normal space, creating acoustic and atmospheric effects that facilitated communication across the boundaries between life and death. Within these chambers, Nox began to establish what would become the most comprehensive collection of ancient Sith knowledge ever assembled in a single location. Texts that had been lost for millennia were reconstructed from the memories of Force ghosts who had studied them during their lifetimes. Techniques that existed nowhere in contemporary Imperial archives were preserved through detailed documentation of spiritual advisors' recollections and practical demonstrations. But the work that took place within these spaces extended far beyond simple historical preservation. Nox's unique position as a living conduit between multiple consciousness streams created opportunities for research and experimentation that were impossible under normal circumstances. Ancient Sith Lords could collaborate directly with each other through their shared host, combining their individual expertise to develop new approaches to problems that had puzzled scholars for generations. The network of researchers and archaeologists that formed around Nox's operations attracted individuals from across Imperial space and beyond. Scholars who had spent their careers studying fragments of ancient knowledge found themselves with access to the original authors of texts they had only dreamed of understanding completely. Archaeological expeditions that had previously required years of careful excavation could now be guided by spirits who possessed intimate knowledge of the sites being explored. The recruitment process for these research teams required careful screening to identify individuals who could work effectively within an environment where the boundary between academic inquiry and mystical communion was deliberately blurred. Traditional Imperial archaeologists often struggled with the psychological challenges of working alongside Force ghosts, while scholars trained exclusively in Sith philosophy sometimes lacked the technical expertise necessary for proper documentation and preservation of discoveries. The expeditions that Nox sponsored during this period represented the most ambitious archaeological undertakings in galactic history, targeting sites that had been considered too dangerous or mysterious for conventional exploration. Armed with detailed knowledge provided by spiritual advisors who had personal experience with these locations, research teams could approach ancient ruins with unprecedented understanding of their construction, purpose, and potential hazards. One particularly significant expedition focused on the remnants of a pre-Republic Sith civilization that had flourished in the unknown regions thousands of years before the establishment of any recorded galactic government. The ruins that were discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the timeline of galactic development and the relationship between different Force-using traditions that had emerged throughout history. The structures found at this site displayed architectural and engineering principles that seemed to anticipate technological developments that wouldn't occur for millennia after their construction. More significantly, the spiritual presence preserved within these ruins suggested forms of Force mastery that differed dramatically from both contemporary Imperial methods and the ancient techniques that Nox's advisors remembered from their own lifetimes. The consciousness that inhabited these ruins had undergone preservation processes so sophisticated that they retained not just memories and knowledge, but active awareness and the ability to learn and adapt to new circumstances. Communicating with these entities required developing entirely new approaches to spiritual binding and interaction, techniques that pushed the boundaries of what even Nox's accumulated experience had prepared them to attempt. The knowledge gained from these communications revolutionized understanding of Force theory and practice in ways that influenced every aspect of Sith development. Concepts that had been accepted as fundamental limitations of individual Force sensitivity were revealed to be simply failures of imagination and technique. Methods for enhancing and expanding natural abilities suggested possibilities that even the most ambitious contemporary Sith Lords had never seriously considered. But perhaps the most significant discovery was evidence that the galaxy's spiritual ecosystem was far more complex and interconnected than anyone had previously suspected. The Force ghosts that Nox had been collecting were not isolated remnants of individual consciousness, but components of a vast network that spanned both space and time, connecting every Force-sensitive being who had ever lived into a cosmic web of shared knowledge and experience. Understanding this network required developing philosophical frameworks that went beyond traditional Sith emphasis on individual power and dominance. The ancient civilizations that had first discovered these connections had built their entire societies around principles of spiritual collaboration and collective consciousness that directly contradicted everything that modern Sith education taught about the nature of strength and authority. The practical applications of this knowledge began to manifest in ways that attracted attention throughout Imperial space and beyond. Nox's ability to coordinate military operations through spiritual advisors who could provide real-time intelligence about enemy movements and strategies gave Imperial forces advantages that conventional tactical thinking couldn't explain or counter effectively. More subtly, the accumulated wisdom of ancient administrators and political theorists began to influence Imperial policy through recommendations that Nox provided to other Dark Council members. Approaches to planetary governance, trade regulation, and diplomatic negotiation that incorporated insights from civilizations that had faced similar challenges across galactic history proved remarkably effective at achieving objectives that had previously seemed impossible. The philosophical evolution that accompanied these practical developments reflected Nox's growing understanding of their own role within the larger patterns of galactic history. Where they had once viewed their spiritual collection as a means to personal power and advancement, they now began to see themselves as a custodian of knowledge that belonged not to any individual but to galactic civilization as a whole. This shift in perspective created tensions with traditional Sith approaches to knowledge and power that emphasized secrecy, competition, and the hoarding of advantages for personal benefit. The ancient spirits that served as Nox's advisors had experienced similar conflicts during their own lifetimes, and their guidance helped navigate the complex ethical and practical challenges that arose from possessing knowledge that could benefit the galaxy while serving a government that was built on principles of domination and exploitation. The meditation techniques that Nox developed to manage the increasingly complex interactions between dozens of consciousness streams created side effects that extended far beyond their original purpose. Extended periods of deep communion with ancient spirits began to produce forms of awareness that transcended normal temporal limitations, allowing glimpses of possible futures and alternate timelines that suggested the long-term consequences of current decisions and policies. These visions were not prophecies in any traditional sense, but rather extrapolations based on patterns that the accumulated experience of ancient spirits could identify within the flow of galactic events. The ability to perceive such patterns provided strategic insight that proved invaluable for both personal decision-making and imperial policy development, though it also created burdens of responsibility that few individuals were equipped to handle effectively. The transformation from ambitious young Sith Lord to keeper of galactic knowledge had occurred gradually enough that its full implications only became apparent as Nox's reputation spread throughout Imperial space and attracted attention from sources that extended far beyond traditional Sith society. Scholars from neutral worlds, Republic researchers working through intermediaries, and even representatives of species that had remained outside galactic civilization entirely began seeking access to the knowledge that had been assembled within Nox's archives. Managing these requests required developing diplomatic skills that had never been part of traditional Sith education, along with ethical frameworks for determining which knowledge could be shared safely and which required continued protection from those who might misuse it for destructive purposes. The ancient spirits who served as advisors had faced similar decisions during their own lifetimes, and their guidance proved essential for navigating challenges that had no contemporary precedent or established procedures. The arrival of the Eternal Fleet changed everything that the galaxy had understood about power, technology, and the nature of galactic civilization itself. Ships appeared in Imperial space without warning. Vessels of impossible design that seemed to ignore conventional limitations of physics and engineering, while demonstrating capabilities that made even the most advanced Imperial and Republic fleets appear primitive by comparison. Behind this overwhelming technological superiority stood Emperor Valkorion, a figure whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, identity, and mystical power. For most members of the Dark Council, the Eternal Empire represented an external threat to be analyzed through traditional strategic frameworks and countered through conventional military and political responses. But Darth Nox's unique experience with consciousness transfer and spiritual binding provided perspective on Valkorion that was unavailable to any other Imperial leader. The failed ritual with Darth Zash had prepared Nox to recognize techniques and capabilities that others might dismiss as impossible or incomprehensible. The intelligence reports that reached the Dark Council described an emperor who seemed to possess knowledge and abilities that spanned multiple lifetimes, who demonstrated familiarity with historical events and personages that should have been accessible only through extensive archival research. But Nox's accumulated spiritual advisors whispered different explanations, suggesting that Valkorion's apparent immortality might be based on consciousness transfer techniques similar to those that Zash had attempted but executed with far greater sophistication and success. This interpretation of Valkorion's nature carried implications that extended far beyond military strategy or diplomatic negotiation. If the Eternal Emperor truly possessed the ability to transfer his consciousness between multiple bodies while retaining accumulated knowledge and experience, then the Eternal Empire represented not just a technological threat, but a fundamental challenge to the basic assumptions upon which Sith philosophy and Imperial society had been constructed. The realization that such techniques were possible on the scale that Valkorion appeared to have achieved forced Nox to reconsider their own relationship with the spiritual advisors they had accumulated. Where they had previously viewed the bound Force ghosts as external resources to be consulted and utilized, the example of Valkorion suggested possibilities for integration and synthesis that could transcend the limitations of individual consciousness entirely. But before these theoretical implications could be fully explored, the practical realities of the Eternal Empire's invasion demanded immediate attention. The Dark Council's attempts to coordinate Imperial resistance were hampered by the speed and overwhelming superiority of Eternal Fleet operations, which struck key Imperial installations with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of Imperial defensive capabilities and strategic priorities. Nox's role in the Imperial response drew upon the accumulated military experience of ancient commanders whose careers had spanned multiple galactic conflicts. The tactical insights provided by spiritual advisors who had faced similar situations of overwhelming enemy advantage proved invaluable for developing strategies that could exploit weaknesses in apparently invincible opposition forces. The battles that followed demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of applying ancient wisdom to contemporary military challenges. Techniques that had proven effective against conventional Imperial and Republic forces often failed completely when applied against Eternal Fleet technology that operated according to principles that none of Nox's spiritual advisors had encountered during their lifetimes. The capture and subsequent carbonite imprisonment came not through military defeat, but through the machinations of Emperor Valkorion himself, whose interest in Nox's unique capabilities had led to intervention at the moment when Imperial resistance seemed most likely to succeed. the consciousness transfer that occurred during this encounter represented a level of mystical manipulation that exceeded even Nox's accumulated experience with spiritual binding and communication. Finding themselves sharing mental space with Valkorian's consciousness created challenges that were both similar to and fundamentally different from the ongoing presence of Darth Zash and the collected Force ghosts that served as spiritual advisors. Where previous consciousness streams had been bound through rituals and agreements that established clear hierarchical relationships, Valkorian's presence operated according to principles that seemed designed to gradually subsume and replace the host consciousness rather than coexist with it. The carbonite imprisonment that followed provided an opportunity for extended internal dialogue between these competing consciousness streams, conversations that took place within a suspended animation environment where normal temporal limitations were largely irrelevant. The dreams and visions that characterized this period were not random neurological activities, but structured explorations of memory, knowledge, and identity that would reshape Nox's understanding of their own nature and destiny. Valkorian's presence within Nox's consciousness provided access to knowledge and perspective that spanned millennia of galactic history, including events and civilizations that had been completely forgotten by contemporary scholars. But this knowledge came with the constant pressure of a personality that sought to dominate and control rather than advise and collaborate, creating ongoing psychological conflicts that required all of Nox's accumulated experience with managing multiple consciousness streams. The spiritual advisors who had served as teachers and guides throughout Nox's development found themselves forced to adapt to circumstances they had never encountered during their own lifetimes. Ancient Sith Lords who had considered themselves masters of consciousness manipulation discovered that they were dealing with techniques and capabilities that exceeded their own historical experience by orders of magnitude. The resolution of these internal conflicts required developing entirely new approaches to consciousness management that incorporated elements from multiple philosophical traditions while creating original solutions to problems that had no historical precedent. The process was both exhausting and enlightening, forcing all parties involved to transcend their previous limitations while maintaining the essential characteristics that defined their individual identities. The awakening from carbonite imprisonment revealed a galaxy that had been transformed by years of eternal empire dominance, where familiar political structures had been replaced by administrative systems that bore little resemblance to the imperial hierarchy that Nox remembered. Allies and enemies had been reshuffled according to new allegiances based on survival and adaptation rather than ideology or historical loyalty. The reunion with surviving companions required careful navigation of relationships that had been strained by years of separation and uncertainty. Kenzal's confusion about which consciousness truly represented his proper master had been compounded by the addition of Valkorian to the already complex internal dynamics that characterized Nox's mental environment. Zalek's warrior culture provided frameworks for understanding loyalty and honor that helped stabilize these relationships while accommodating the changes that had occurred during the imprisonment period. The internal resolution of Zash's consciousness represented one of the most significant developments to emerge from the carbonite experience. The extended period of forced coexistence with multiple competing consciousness streams had created opportunities for negotiation and compromise that had been impossible under the pressured circumstances of normal daily existence. The arrangement that emerged from these negotiations provided Zash with greater autonomy and influence while maintaining Nox's essential identity and decision-making authority. The new alliances that formed during the struggle against eternal empire dominance required cooperation with individuals and organizations that had previously been considered enemies or competitors. Republic forces, independent systems, and even criminal organizations found themselves working together against a common threat that transcended traditional political and ideological boundaries. Nox's role in this broader resistance movement drew upon the accumulated diplomatic experience of ancient administrators and political theorists whose careers had involved managing similarly complex alliance structures. The ability to find common ground between groups with fundamentally different objectives and worldviews proved essential for maintaining cooperation that was necessary for effective resistance operations. The philosophical implications of these alliances extended beyond immediate tactical necessities to encompass questions about the nature of galactic civilization and the relationship between individual ambition and collective survival. The ancient spirits who served as Nox's advisors had witnessed similar periods of crisis during their own lifetimes, and their guidance proved invaluable for maintaining perspective during circumstances that could easily lead to despair or nihilistic abandonment of long-term objectives. The gradual emergence of effective resistance to Eternal Empire control demonstrated that even overwhelming technological and military superiority could be countered through sustained effort and creative adaptation. The techniques that proved most effective often combined elements from multiple historical approaches to asymmetric warfare, creating strategies that were both innovative and grounded in proven principles of resistance and survival. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was Nox's growing understanding of their role as a bridge between different eras of galactic history. The knowledge and perspective accumulated through decades of spiritual binding and consciousness management provided unique insights into patterns and possibilities that were invisible to individuals limited to single lifetime perspectives. The galaxy that emerged from the chaos of the Eternal Empire crisis bore little resemblance to the civilization that had existed before Valkorian's intervention, and Darth Nox found themselves uniquely positioned to help navigate the complex process of rebuilding institutions, relationships, and philosophical frameworks that could accommodate the profound changes that had occurred. The accumulated wisdom of dozens of ancient consciousness streams provided perspective on similar periods of transformation throughout galactic history, offering guidance for challenges that few contemporary leaders possessed the experience to address effectively. The great archives that Nox established during this period represented more than simple repositories of historical knowledge or mystical technique. These were institutions designed to preserve and transmit the accumulated wisdom of galactic civilization across generations, while adapting to changing circumstances and technological developments that could render traditional preservation methods obsolete. The planning and construction of such facilities required integration of insights from multiple historical periods, combining architectural principles from ancient Sith temples with organizational methods developed by long-vanished academic institutions. The selection and training of personnel for these archives demanded careful attention to individuals who could work effectively within environments where the boundary between scholarly research and mystical communion was deliberately maintained at minimum levels. Traditional academics often lacked the psychological resilience necessary for sustained interaction with Force spirits, while individuals trained exclusively in mystical traditions sometimes failed to appreciate the importance of rigorous documentation and systematic analysis. The curriculum that developed within these institutions reflected Nox's growing understanding of knowledge as a living system, rather than a static collection of facts and techniques. Ancient Sith Lords who served as spiritual advisors contributed not just their memories of historical events, but their ongoing analysis and interpretation of contemporary developments, creating educational opportunities that were impossible to replicate through conventional teaching methods. Students who demonstrated exceptional aptitude for this integrated approach to learning found themselves participants in conversations that spanned millennia of galactic development, gaining perspective on current events through comparison with similar situations that had occurred throughout history. The psychological demands of such education were considerable, requiring mental discipline and emotional stability that exceeded the requirements of most traditional academic programs. But the benefits of this educational approach became apparent as graduates began to apply their accumulated knowledge to practical challenges throughout the recovering galaxy. Administrative techniques that incorporated insights from multiple historical approaches to governance proved remarkably effective at managing the complex political situations that characterized post-crisis reconstruction efforts. Military applications of ancient strategic knowledge provided tactical advantages that helped stabilize regions where conventional approaches to peacekeeping had failed to address underlying sources of conflict. Commanders who had studied historical precedents through direct communication with ancient military leaders demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what their formal training should have provided. The diplomatic applications proved equally valuable as representatives trained in Nox's archives demonstrated remarkable skill at finding common ground between groups whose fundamental worldviews seemed completely incompatible. The accumulated experience of ancient negotiators and political theorists provided frameworks for understanding cultural differences and identifying shared interests that were invisible to individuals limited to contemporary perspective. The philosophical evolution that accompanied these practical applications reflected broader changes in how galactic civilization understood its own nature and destiny. The traditional emphasis on competition and domination that had characterized both imperial and republic approaches to galactic development began to give way to models that emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit as more effective methods for achieving long-term stability and prosperity. These changes were not merely idealistic wishful thinking, but were grounded in practical experience accumulated across thousands of years of galactic history. Ancient civilizations that had attempted to build sustainable institutions had consistently discovered that approaches based on exploitation and domination ultimately created instabilities that led to collapse and renewal, while systems that emphasized balance and cooperation tended to persist for far longer periods. The meditation practices that Nox developed during this period created opportunities for extended communion with the network of consciousness that connected every force-sensitive being who had ever lived. These sessions provided access to knowledge and perspective that transcended individual experience while offering glimpses of possible futures based on current trends and decisions. The visions that emerged from these meditations were not prophecies in any deterministic sense, but rather explorations of probability and consequence that could guide decision-making without eliminating the fundamental uncertainty that characterized all future developments. Understanding these possibilities required philosophical frameworks that could accommodate both individual agency and systemic inevitability, concepts that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of causation and responsibility. The preservation techniques that were developed for the most dangerous and powerful knowledge required careful balance between accessibility for worthy students and protection from those who might misuse such information for destructive purposes. Ancient spirits who had faced similar decisions during their own lifetimes provided guidance about criteria and safeguards that could minimize risks while ensuring that valuable knowledge would not be lost through excessive caution. The ethical frameworks that governed these preservation decisions incorporated insights from multiple philosophical traditions while developing original approaches to questions that had no clear historical precedents. The responsibility of determining which knowledge could be shared safely and which required continued protection created burdens that few individuals were equipped to handle without extensive preparation and ongoing support. The training programs for new generations of scholar practitioners emphasized not just technical mastery of ancient techniques, but philosophical understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied access to such power. Students learned to view themselves as custodians of knowledge that belonged to galactic civilization as a whole, rather than resources for personal advancement or factional advantage. The recruitment process for these programs required identification of individuals who possessed both exceptional intellectual capability and sufficient emotional maturity to handle the psychological challenges of sustained interaction with ancient consciousness streams. The screening procedures that were developed incorporated insights from multiple historical approaches to identifying and developing talent while adapting to contemporary circumstances and requirements. The collaborative relationships that formed between institutions established by Nox and similar organizations throughout the galaxy created networks of knowledge sharing that transcended traditional political and cultural boundaries. Scholars from Republic worlds, imperial territories, and independent systems found themselves working together on projects that required expertise from multiple sources while contributing to understanding that benefited galactic civilization as a whole. The research projects that emerged from these collaborations addressed fundamental questions about the nature of the Force consciousness and galactic development that had puzzled scholars for generations. Access to preserved knowledge from civilizations that had approached these questions from different philosophical perspectives provided opportunities for synthesis and integration that had been impossible when each tradition remained isolated from the others. The practical applications of this collaborative research began to influence technology development, medical treatment, and engineering projects throughout the galaxy. Ancient understanding of force physics provided insights that enhanced conventional scientific methods while suggesting possibilities for advancement that purely materialistic approaches had been unable to achieve. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the growing recognition that galactic civilization had reached a threshold where traditional approaches to development and expansion were no longer sustainable. The accumulated experience of ancient civilizations suggested that continued growth based on exploitation and domination would inevitably lead to conflicts that could destroy everything that had been built over millennia of development. The alternative approaches that were beginning to emerge incorporated principles of balance and sustainability that drew upon wisdom preserved from civilizations that had successfully navigated similar transitions. These models suggested possibilities for galactic development that could maintain the benefits of technological advancement and cultural sophistication while avoiding the destructive cycles that had characterized much of recorded history. The vision that was taking shape through these developments represented not just personal achievement or institutional success, but the emergence of new forms of galactic civilization that could transcend the limitations that had constrained previous attempts at creating sustainable peace and prosperity. The knowledge and perspective that Nox had accumulated through decades of spiritual communion and consciousness management was contributing to possibilities that extended far beyond individual ambition or factional advantage to encompass the long-term survival and flourishing of galactic civilization itself. In the twilight years of a life that had spanned more adventures and transformations than most civilizations experienced across entire eras, Darth Nox found themselves contemplating questions that extended far beyond personal legacy or institutional achievement. The accumulated wisdom of dozens of ancient consciousness streams had created a perspective that transcended individual mortality while embracing the cyclical nature of knowledge, power, and responsibility that characterized the deepest patterns of galactic development. The final transformation was both subtle and profound, marking the evolution from collector of ancient wisdom to guardian of knowledge that required protection as much as preservation. The most dangerous techniques and forbidden secrets that had been gathered over decades of spiritual communion were not meant for widespread distribution, but needed to be maintained in trust for future generations who might possess the wisdom to use them responsibly. The decision to establish permanent guardianship over these most sensitive materials required careful consideration of ethical frameworks that had been developed through consultation with ancient spirits who had faced similar responsibilities during their own lifetimes. The accumulated experience of civilizations that had successfully managed dangerous knowledge provided guidance for creating safeguards that could protect galactic society while ensuring that valuable insights would not be lost through excessive caution or institutional decay. The physical locations chosen for these ultimate repositories were selected not just for their security and accessibility, but for their spiritual significance within the broader network of Force-sensitive sites that connected conscious beings across space and time. Ancient temples that had served similar purposes for previous civilizations were restored and enhanced with modern technology while maintaining the mystical environments necessary for effective communion with preserved consciousness streams. The meditation chambers within these facilities became spaces where the boundaries between past, present, and future seemed to dissolve under the influence of accumulated spiritual presence. Extended sessions of deep communion with the galactic network of Force consciousness provided access to possibilities and probabilities that extended far beyond individual lifetime perspectives, offering glimpses of potential developments that could span centuries or millennia. These visions were not prophecies that predetermined future events, but rather explorations of consequence and possibility that could guide current decisions while respecting the fundamental uncertainty that characterized all conscious choice and development. Understanding these patterns required philosophical frameworks that could accommodate both individual agency and systemic inevitability, concepts that had been refined through decades of interaction with ancient wisdom traditions. The companions who had shared Nox's journey found their own paths toward resolution and peace as the final phase of their adventures approached. Kenval's confusion about which consciousness truly represented his proper master had evolved into acceptance of a relationship that transcended traditional concepts of service and loyalty. The ancient Dashade had become not just a servant, but a participant in preserving knowledge that would benefit future generations of Force users. Zalek's warrior culture provided frameworks for understanding honor and duty that helped him adapt to his role as protector of institutions rather than conqueror of enemies. His training in both Kaleesh traditions and Sith methods created a unique perspective that proved invaluable for managing the security requirements of facilities that house the galaxy's most dangerous and valuable knowledge. The resolution of Darth Zash's consciousness within Nox's expanded mental collective represented one of the most significant achievements of the entire journey. The former master's desperate ambition for immortality had been transformed through decades of enforced cooperation into genuine collaboration focused on preserving and transmitting knowledge rather than accumulating personal power. Her expertise in ancient Sith techniques remained invaluable, while her destructive impulses had been tempered by exposure to wisdom traditions that emphasized balance and responsibility. The networks of scholars, practitioners, and guardians that had formed around Nox's institutions continued to grow and develop, even as their founder began to step back from direct involvement in daily operations. The educational programs that had been established were producing graduates whose capabilities exceeded what any single traditional approach to Force training could have achieved, creating the foundations for forms of galactic civilization that could transcend the limitations of previous historical patterns. The collaborative relationships between different knowledge traditions had evolved beyond simple information sharing to encompass joint research projects that addressed fundamental questions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence itself. Republic scholars, imperial researchers, and independent investigators found themselves working together on investigations that required expertise from multiple philosophical and methodological approaches. The technological applications that emerged from these collaborations began to influence development projects throughout the galaxy in ways that suggested possibilities for advancement that could benefit all conscious beings rather than serving narrow factional interests. Ancient understanding of Force physics provided insights that enhanced conventional scientific methods while respecting the ethical considerations that governed the use of such knowledge. But perhaps the most significant development was the growing recognition throughout galactic society that sustainable civilization required approaches to knowledge and power that emphasized stewardship rather than exploitation. The accumulated experience of ancient civilizations that had successfully navigated similar challenges provided models for development that could maintain technological sophistication while avoiding the destructive cycles that had characterized much of recorded history. The final years were marked by increasingly extended periods of meditation and communion with the vast network of consciousness that connected every force-sensitive being across space and time. These sessions provided access to perspectives that spanned the entire history of galactic civilization, while offering insights into possibilities that extended far into potential futures. The peace that characterized these contemplative periods was not the exhausted quiet of completed ambition, but the serene satisfaction of knowledge preserved and wisdom transmitted to worthy successors. The spiritual advisors who had accompanied Nox throughout their journey expressed their own sense of completion as the knowledge they had preserved found new expressions through institutions and individuals who could carry their insights forward into unknown futures. The physical locations that had served as centers for this unprecedented accumulation of ancient wisdom began to take on qualities that transcended their original purposes as research facilities and educational institutions. The spiritual presence that had accumulated within these spaces created environments where the very atmosphere seemed alive with accumulated knowledge and possibility. Visitors to these sites reported experiences that ranged from subtle enhancement of their own force sensitivity to profound visions that provided insight into their personal destinies and the broader patterns of galactic development. The facilities had become not just repositories of preserved knowledge, but active participants in the ongoing evolution of galactic consciousness. The final meditations took place within chambers that had been prepared according to specifications provided by ancient spirits who had undergone similar transitions during their own lifetimes. The process was neither death nor conventional life, but transformation into a form of existence that could transcend individual mortality while maintaining the essential characteristics that defined personal identity and accumulated wisdom. The legacy that remained extended far beyond institutional achievements or preserved knowledge to encompass the living example of possibilities that had been demonstrated through a single individual's journey from slavery to mastery of forces that shaped galactic destiny. The transformation from powerless property to keeper of civilization's most precious wisdom represented hope for all conscious beings who sought to transcend the limitations of their origins while contributing to the greater good of galactic society. In the deepest archives beneath worlds that had become pilgrimage sites for seekers of ancient wisdom, crystalline storage matrices preserved not just the techniques and knowledge that Darth Nox accumulated, but the essence of conversations with consciousness streams that span the entire history of galactic civilization. Future scholars who possess sufficient wisdom and preparation can still access these preserved interactions, continuing dialogues that began in the tombs of Korriban and evolved into the foundations for new forms of galactic understanding. The story ends not with finality, but with continuation, as knowledge preserved through one individual's extraordinary journey becomes the foundation for possibilities that extend beyond imagination into futures, where wisdom guides power and consciousness transcends the boundaries that once seemed absolute. In the gentle hum of preservation crystals and the whispered conversations of ancient spirits, the legend of Darth Nox continues to influence galactic development in ways that ensure their most profound discoveries will benefit conscious beings across generations yet to come. The stars themselves seem to pulse with the rhythm of accumulated knowledge, carrying forward the legacy of one who discovered that true immortality comes not through conquest of death, but through preservation of wisdom that can guide the living toward futures worthy of the struggles required to achieve them.